Tonight's relentless downpour was forcing travelers off the flooded county road in droves. Jack Harmon, a solitary farmer who had spent 25 years cultivating the same fields his grandfather had, never hesitated to welcome those seeking shelter. The lingering questions about his family history all seemed distant when he could offer refuge to strangers, but when one drenched visitor revealed her badge, Jack's understanding of his own past would be forever transformed. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jack Harmon woke before dawn, as he had every day for the past quarter-century. The first rays of sunlight hadn't yet broken the horizon when his feet hit the cold wooden floor of the bedroom that had been his sanctuary since childhood. His morning routine remained unchanged. Coffee brewed in the battered pot his wife Elena had purchased before the car accident claimed her life 6 years ago. 2 sugars, no cream, just like always. The century-old farmhouse creaked with familiar sounds, though it echoed with emptiness since he'd been living alone. Jack moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, the quiet punctuated only by the ticking of the antique wall clock that had belonged to his grandfather. The same grandfather who had taught him everything he knew about working the land. Morning. Elena, Jack murmured to the framed photograph on the counter. Her smile remained frozen in time, eyes crinkling at the corners in that way he missed with a physical ache that hadn't diminished with the passing years. 6 years, 2 months, and 14 days. Not that he was counting. The local radio crackled with static as the weather announcer warned of a severe thunderstorm system approaching from the west. A heavy rainfall expected throughout the evening, with potential for flash flooding along County Roads 17 and 22. Residents are advised to secure loose items and prepare for possible power outages. Jack glanced at the empty chair across from him, where Elena used to sit reading the newspaper each morning, circling garage sales and community events with her red pen. Holidays and anniversaries were the hardest. The empty spaces seemed to multiply around those dates, vacant chairs at the dining table that once held laughter and conversation. His daughter, Lily, had moved across the country after college, pursuing her dreams in California. Something about graphic design for a tech company. He couldn't quite keep track of the details. They spoke on video calls occasionally, but visits had become increasingly rare. Last Christmas, it had been a brief 3-day stay filled with Lily, checking her phone and answering work emails. The distance between them wasn't just geographical, just another Tuesday, Jack muttered to himself, pulling on his weathered work boots. The leather was cracked, but still serviceable, much like Jack himself at 53. The farm demanded constant attention. 40 acres of wheat, an apple orchard that had been his grandfather's pride, and a small herd of cattle that provided a steady, if modest, income. The work was good for him, filled the hours that might otherwise be consumed by memories and questions. Jack had been raised by his grandparents after his parents died, or at least that's what he'd been told. Harold and Margaret Harmon had been tight-lipped about his parents, offering only vague references to a car accident when Jack was just 2 years old. No photographs, no stories, no family history beyond what began when he arrived at the farm. He'd tried asking questions as a child, but his grandmother would change the subject, and his grandfather would become uncharacteristically stern. Eventually, Jack stopped asking. He'd accepted the Harmon farm as his inheritance and his legacy, even if the first chapters of his story remained shrouded in mystery. As Jack stepped onto the porch, the air felt heavy with impending rain. The wheat fields stretched out before him, golden waves rippling in the morning breeze. He surveyed his land with a practiced eye, noting the fence section that needed mending and the tractor that required an oil change before the coming storm. The farm's ancient border collie, Max, limped up beside him, grey muzzle and cloudy eyes, showing his advanced age. "Morning, old-timer," Jack said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Going to be a wet one today." Dust. Max had been Elena's dog originally. Now he was just another reminder of what Jack had lost, but also what he still had to care for. The dog followed him as he made his rounds, checking on the cattle and securing equipment that might be damaged. In the coming storm, by noon, dark clouds had begun to gather on the western horizon, transforming the blue sky into an ominous grey canvas. Jack worked through his mental checklist with increased urgency, making sure the drainage ditches were clear, moving the younger cattle to the covered portion of the pasture, and bringing the tractor into the barn. The first fat raindrops began to fall as he made his way back to the house, Max trotting dutifully behind him. Inside, Jack shook the rain from his jacket and turned on the television to check the weather report. The meteorologist's expression was serious as she pointed to swirling patterns of red and yellow on the radar map. "This system has intensified since our morning report," she explained. "We're now expecting rainfall of up to 4 inches in some areas, with severe thunderstorm warnings issued for the following counties." Jack recognized his county among those listed. He'd weathered plenty of storms over the years, but something about the urgency in the reporter's voice gave him pause. He moved through the house, checking windows and collecting emergency supplies, flashlights, batteries, candles, and bottled water. As the afternoon deepened into evening, the storm's intensity grew. Rain lashed against the windows, driven by howling winds that made the old house groan in protest. The electricity flickered once, twice, then stabilized. Jack sat at his kitchen table, a mug of fresh coffee warming his hands as he reviewed the farm's financial records, bills that needed paying, equipment that needed replacing, and the ever-thinning margin between profit and loss. The sound of the rain was almost hypnotic, drowning out the usual creaks and settling noises of the old farmhouse. Jack found himself staring at a photograph album he kept in the drawer beneath the telephone. Pictures of his grandparents, of Elena, of Lily growing up on the farm. There were no photos of his parents. Not a single one. Sometimes, in quiet moments, like this, Jack wondered about them. What had they looked like? Did he have his mother's eyes or his father's laugh? Were there other relatives out there somewhere, unknown to him? The questions were old companions, familiar but never fully welcome. The sudden sound of a car engine struggling against the storm pulled Jack from his thoughts. Headlights swept across the kitchen wall as a vehicle turned into his long gravel driveway. Visitors were rare at the Harmon farm on good days, unheard of during weather like this. Jack peered through the rain-streaked window, watching as a mud-splattered SUV came to a stop near his front porch. The downpour had intensified to the point where the vehicle's windshield wipers could barely keep up. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating 3 silhouettes inside the car. With a sigh, Jack grabbed his raincoat from the hook by the door. "Stay, Max!" he commanded, though the elderly dog showed no intention of venturing into the storm. Pulling the coat tight around his shoulders, Jack stepped onto the porch just as the SUV's doors opened. 3 figures dashed through the rain toward the shelter of his porch. A tall man in a business suit now soaked through, a middle-aged woman clutching a laptop bag above her head in a futile attempt to stay dry, and a teenage boy with headphones around his neck. "Sorry to bother you," the man shouted over the howling wind, water streaming from his hair down his face. "The bridge on County Road 22 is flooded, and we tried to find another route. But our GPS sent us down this road, and now we're completely turned around." Jack nodded, gesturing toward the door. "Come inside. You can't be driving in this." The 3 strangers hurried into the warmth of Jack's kitchen, dripping water onto the worn linoleum floor. Max raised his head from his bed in the corner, giving a perfunctory woof before settling back down. "I'm Richard Collins," the man said, extending a dripping hand which Jack shook firmly. "This is my wife Diana and our son Tyler. We were heading Back from a college visit in Springfield when the storm caught us. Jack Harmon, he replied, retrieving a stack of towels from the hall closet. You folks are lucky you found this place. Not much out here for miles, and that bridge won't be passable until morning, if I know anything about these storms. Diana accepted a towel gratefully, dabbing at her sodden blouse. We really appreciate this, Mr. Harmon. Most people wouldn't open their door to strangers these days. Jack shrugged, the ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. My grandfather believed in lending a hand to those in need. Said you never know when you might be the one needing help. He moved to the stove, lifting the coffee pot. Coffee? It's fresh, and I've got some soup I can heat up if you're hungry. The Collins family settled at Jack's kitchen table, gratitude evident in their postures as they warmed themselves with steaming mugs. Tyler, the teenager, looked around curiously, his gaze lingering on the antique farm implements that decorated the walls. This place is old school, he remarked, earning a sharp look from his mother. Jack chuckled. Been in the family for generations. Not much has changed since my grandfather's time. You live here alone? Diana asked, blowing gently on her coffee. Just me and Max these days, Jack replied, nodding toward the dog. My wife passed 6 years ago. Daughter's out in California. I'm sorry to hear that, Richard said quietly. The conventional phrase of sympathy felt genuine in the warm kitchen, surrounded by the storm's fury outside. As Jack ladled homemade vegetable soup into bowls, the lights flickered again, this time plunging the kitchen into darkness for several seconds before humming back to life. Power grid struggling, Jack commented, placing the soup bowls on the table. I've got a generator if it goes out completely. Gets pretty dark out here without electricity. The conversation flowed easily. As they ate, the Collins family shared details about their lives in Des Moines, where Richard worked as an architect and Diana taught high school English. Tyler was considering engineering programs, hence the college visits. You've been farming all your life? Diana asked, clearly interested in their host. Jack nodded, settling back in his chair. Born and raised right here. My grandparents took me in when I was just a toddler, never knew anything else but this land. Your parents? Diana inquired gently, her teacher's instinct for drawing out stories evident. Jack's expression remained neutral, though something flickered briefly in his eyes. Car accident when I was 2. At least that's what I was told. My grandparents didn't talk about it much. Tyler, who had been scrolling through his phone despite the spotty reception, looked up. You don't know anything about them, Tyler, his father admonished, but Jack waved it off. It's all right. Not much to tell, really. No photos, no stories. My birth certificate has their names, Thomas and Catherine Harmon, but not much else. My grandparents raised me as their own, and I'm grateful for that. The kitchen fell silent, except for the persistent drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. Jack rarely spoke of this absence in his life, this blank space where family history should be. Somehow, the presence of these strangers made the admission easier. The moment was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle approaching. Headlights once again swept across the kitchen windows, illuminating the surprised faces of everyone at the table. Seems like you're a unpopular destination tonight, Richard remarked as Jack rose to his feet. That's unusual, Jack muttered, moving to the window. Through the curtain of rain, he could make out the outline of a police cruiser, its roof lights cutting through the darkness with rhythmic flashes of blue and red. Max lifted his head, more alert now, as Jack pulled on his raincoat once more, probably checking the roads. The sheriff's department does that during bad storms. The wind nearly yanked the door from Jack's hand as he stepped onto the porch. The police cruiser had parked beside the Collins' SUV, and 2 figures were making their way through the downpour, one tall in a uniform, the other smaller, hunched against the rain. Evening, Jack called out, raising his voice above the storm. The officer reached the porch first, pushing back a hood to reveal a woman in her 40s, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Water streamed from her department-issued raincoat as she nodded in greeting. "Sorry to intrude, sir. I'm Sergeant Kate Martinez with the County Sheriff's Department. This is my daughter, Abby." She gestured to the teenager now standing beside her, looking miserable and drenched. "We're checking on residents along this road. The Elmwood Creek Bridge has washed out completely, and we're advising people to stay put until morning." "Already got some stranded travelers inside," Jack replied, holding the door open wider. "You're welcome to come in and dry off. No sense standing in this weather." Sergeant Martinez hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Much appreciated. Our patrol car can handle most conditions, but this storm is something else. Radio's been non-stop. With calls." The kitchen felt crowded but cozy, with the addition of 2 more guests. Introductions were made, as Jack provided fresh towels and added water to the soup pot. Abby, around 17, sat quietly beside her mother, occasionally casting curious glances around the farmhouse. "We've got 3 other units out checking properties," Sergeant Martinez explained, accepting a mug of coffee. "The west side of the county got hit hardest. This is the first time I've seen Elmwood Creek rise high enough to take out that bridge." "Happened back in '97 too," Jack commented. "My grandfather had to rescue some cattle that got stranded on the wrong side." As the sergeant warmed her hands around the mug, Jack noticed her studying him with an odd expression, her brows slightly furrowed, as if trying to place his face. "Have we met before, Mr. Harmon?" she asked suddenly. "You look familiar." "Somehow." Jack shook his head. "Don't think so. I don't get into town much these days, mostly keep to myself and the farm." "Harmon?" she repeated, as if testing the name. "Any relation to the Harmons from Cedar Ridge?" "Not that I know of," Jack replied. "Just my grandparents' family here. They passed years ago." Sergeant Martinez nodded slowly, but her eyes remained thoughtful, occasionally returning to Jack's face throughout the conversation. There was something in her scrutiny that made Jack vaguely uncomfortable, though he couldn't place why. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. The wind howled around the corners of the old farmhouse, and the rain continued its relentless assault. Inside, however, the unexpected gathering of strangers had transformed Jack's usually quiet evening into something almost festive. As the evening progressed, the power finally surrendered to the storm's assault. The lights went out with a definitive click, plunging the kitchen into darkness. Jack, prepared as always, had already placed flashlights strategically around the house. "Everyone stay put," his voice came calmly through the darkness. "I'll get the generator running." Within minutes, Jack had navigated his way to the back porch where the backup generator was housed. The machine sputtered to life with a roar that was quickly swallowed by the storm's fury. Moments later, essential lights flickered back on throughout the main floor of the farmhouse. "Sorry about that," Jack said, returning to the kitchen, rain dripping from his coat. "Generator will keep the essentials going. Lights, refrigerator. Well, pump for water. Won't be enough power for the heating system, though. Might get chilly later." "You're better prepared than most," Sergeant Martinez commented, helping to light candles that Jack had placed on the table. The soft glow created a surprisingly intimate atmosphere in the kitchen, shadows dancing across the faces of the unexpected gathering. "When you live out here, you learn to be self-sufficient," Jack replied with a shrug. "I've got spare bedrooms upstairs for everyone. They haven't been used in a while, but the sheets are clean." Diana Collins glanced at her watch. "It's getting late. Perhaps we should all turn in and hope the storm passes by morning." Jack nodded in agreement, gathering additional flashlights for his guests. "I'll show you folks to your rooms. Sergeant, you and your daughter can take my daughter's old room. It has twin beds." As the Collins family followed Jack upstairs, Sergeant Martinez remained in the kitchen with Abby, her expression pensive. Jack returned a few minutes later to find the sergeant studying the few family photos he kept on the refrigerator door. "Need anything else before you head up?" Jack asked, startling her slightly. Sergeant Martinez turned, her professional demeanor momentarily slipping to reveal something that looked almost like confusion. Mr. Harmon, I don't mean to pry, but I overheard you telling the Collins family about your parents. You said they died in a car accident. Jack leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. That's right. When I was just a toddler. Why do you ask? The sergeant seemed to hesitate, weighing her words carefully. What were their names again? Thomas and Catherine Harmon. At least according to my birth certificate. Like I said, my grandparents didn't share much about them. Sergeant Martinez reached for her jacket, which had been draped over a kitchen chair to dry. From an inner pocket, she withdrew a waterproof wallet. Her fingers, steady in crisis situations, but now strangely uncertain, fumbled with the clasp. Mr. Harmon, I need to show you something, she said finally, her voice taking on an odd formality. It might seem strange. Jack felt a sudden tightness in his chest, an inexplicable anticipation. He watched as the sergeant carefully extracted a photograph protected in plastic and placed it on the kitchen table beneath the glow of a battery-powered lantern. The photo showed a young couple, perhaps in their late 20s, standing in front of a modest home. Between them stood a small boy, no more than 2 years old, grinning widely at the camera. The colors had faded somewhat with age, but the image remained clear. This is my sister Jessica and her husband Daniel, Sergeant Martinez said quietly. And their son, Jacob. The photo was taken about 50 years ago. Jack stared at the image, uncomprehending at first. The man in the photograph had the same cleft chin that Jack saw in the mirror every morning. The woman had eyes shaped exactly like his own. And the child. The child's smile was hauntingly familiar. I don't understand, Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. Who are these people to me? Sergeant Martinez took a deep breath. My sister and her husband were killed in a flash flood in 1975. Their car was swept off a low-water bridge, and during a storm, not unlike this one. She paused, watching Jack's face carefully. Their son, my nephew, was not in the car. He was staying with neighbors while Jessica and Daniel attended a wedding. After their death, the boy was supposed to come live with my parents, but there was confusion with social services. Jack felt the room tilt slightly, his grip on the kitchen counter tightening. What are you saying? Abby, who had been silently observing the conversation, moved closer to her mother. Her eyes darted between Jack's face and the photograph with growing comprehension. The boy was placed with a foster family almost immediately, Sergeant Martinez continued. By the time my parents sorted through the legal process, they were told he had been adopted by a couple named Harold and Margaret. Harmon, Jack finished, his voice hollow. My grandparents. Sergeant Martinez nodded slowly. We were told the adoption was closed at the request of the new family. My parents tried to fight it, but in those days... She trailed off, then added, they never stopped looking for him. For you. Jack's legs suddenly felt unsteady. He pulled out a kitchen chair and sat heavily, his eyes fixed on the photograph. But my birth certificate says Thomas and Catherine Harmon. They must have changed your legal parents to cover the adoption, Sergeant Martinez suggested. Your real parents were Daniel and Jessica Rivera, my sister. The name struck Jack like a physical blow. Rivera, not Harmon, a whole identity he had. Never known. I'm Rivera. He tested the name, foreign on his tongue yet somehow resonant. You were born Jacob Daniel Rivera, Sergeant Martinez confirmed. You would have been raised by my parents in Cedar Ridge. Our family has lived there for generations. Jack's mind raced with implications. Cedar Ridge was just 30 miles away, a neighboring county he'd visited countless times over the years. How many times had he passed relatives on the street, never knowing the connection? Had he and Sergeant Martinez crossed paths before this night? This is a lot to take in, Jack managed, his voice unsteady. Sergeant Martinez, his aunt, nodded with understanding. I know, I never expected to find you like this. It's almost unbelievable. Abby, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "Mom has your baby pictures. Grandma kept everything, your toys, your clothes. They never believed you were gone forever." Jack looked up at the teenager with new eyes. Not a stranger's child, but family, his cousin's daughter. His blood! "How did you recognize me?" Jack asked the sergeant. "After all these years?" "Your eyes," she answered simply. "They're exactly like my sister's, and that cleft in your chin, that's the Rivera chin. All the men in our family have it." She paused. "When you said your name was Harmon and mentioned being orphaned as a toddler, the timing matched. I just knew." The revelation seemed to expand in the small kitchen, filling the space between them. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside, a different kind of upheaval was taking place. "Did you ever find out why?" Jack asked after a long silence. Why the Harmons kept this from me?" Sergeant Martinez shook her head. "We tried to contact them several times over the years. Letters were returned. Phone calls went unanswered. Eventually, my parents had to accept that the Harmons wanted a clean break from your past." Jack thought of his grandparents, the people he'd known as his grandparents. They had been loving, devoted caregivers. They had given him a good life, a legacy in this farm. Yet they had also erased his history, cut him off from a family that had mourned his loss. "I have cousins?" Jack asked, trying to comprehend the extent of this newfound family. "4," Sergeant Martinez replied with a small smile. "My 2 children, and my brother has twins. They're all around Abby's age. My father, your grandfather, passed away 10 years ago, but your grandmother is still alive, Elena Rivera. She's 88 now, still sharp as a tack." Jack struggled to process the information. Family members, living, breathing relatives with shared blood and history, had been within reach his entire life. People who knew his parents, who could tell him stories, who might even have photos. "My daughter should know this," Jack said, thinking of Lily in California. "She has a whole family she's never met. We would love to meet her," Sergeant Martinez said softly, reaching across the table to touch Jack's hand hesitantly. The gesture was tentative, as if she feared he might pull away. "If you're willing, of course. This is your decision, Jack. I know it's overwhelming." Jack stared at the photograph again, studying the faces of the people who had brought him into the world. His mother had his same high cheekbones. His father stood tall and straight, just as Jack did. They were strangers to him, yet unmistakably connected. In his mind, fragments of early memories stirred. A woman's laugh, the scent of cinnamon, a man's strong hands lifting him high. Memories he had always dismissed as dreams or imagination, now taking on new significance. "All these years," Jack murmured, "I thought I knew who I was." "You're still the same person," Sergeant Martinez assured him. "You're just more than you knew." Their conversation was interrupted by a creaking floorboard. They looked up to find Richard Collins standing in the doorway, an apologetic expression on his face. "Sorry to interrupt," he said quickly. "I was just looking for a glass of water. I'll come back later." "No, it's fine," Jack said, suddenly aware of how dramatic the scene must appear. The photo on the table, the intensity of their conversation. "Just family matters." Richard nodded, grabbing a glass from the cabinet. "Seems like the storm might be letting up a bit," he commented, filling his glass from the tap. "Wind's not as fierce." Jack hadn't noticed, but listening now, he realized the constant battering against the windows had indeed lessened. A fitting metaphor, perhaps, clarity emerging as the storm receded. After Richard departed, Sergeant Martinez, Kate, as he supposed, he should start thinking of her, regarded Jack with obvious concern. "We should probably get some rest," she suggested gently. "Tomorrow, when the road's clear, if you want, you could come meet Elena, your grandmother. She lives with me now." The thought was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. An 88-year-old woman who had never stopped hoping to find her lost grandson. What would she see when she looked at him? Would she recognize anything of the toddler she had known? "I'd like that," Jack said finally, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I'd like to meet her." As they prepared to head upstairs, Jack paused by the refrigerator, looking at the photos displayed there. Elena, his wife; Lily, his daughter; the Harmon farm in different seasons; his life as he had known it. "Do you think they meant well?" he asked suddenly. "The Harmons. Do you think they thought they were doing what was best?" Kate considered the question carefully. "I'd like to believe so. They gave you a home, raised you with love. Maybe they thought a clean break would be less confusing for a child so young." She paused. "But they took something from you too, the right to know your own story." Jack nodded, unable to reconcile his feelings toward the people who had raised him. Gratitude and betrayal warred within him, along with a profound sense of loss for the life he might have had with the Riveras. "One more thing," Kate said, reaching into her wallet again. She extracted another photograph and handed it to Jack. This one showed a much older woman surrounded by children and teenagers. A family gathering of some kind. "That's Elena, your grandmother, at her birthday last year. Those are your cousins, your family." Jack held the photograph carefully, as if it might dissolve at his touch. A family he had never known existed, yet connected to him by bonds of blood and shared history. "Thank you," he said simply, unable to express the complex emotions surging through him. As they climbed the stairs to the second floor, the old farmhouse creaked around them, familiar sounds that had been the backdrop to Jack's entire life. Yet now everything felt different. The very foundations of his identity had shifted, leaving him to rebuild his understanding of himself piece by piece. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to subside, the first hints of a clearing sky visible through breaks in the clouds. By morning, the roads would be passable again. The Collins family would continue their journey home, and Jack Harmon, Jacob Rivera, would begin a journey of his own. Sleep eluded Jack that night. He lay awake in his bedroom, staring at the ceiling as rain continued to patter against the roof, though with diminishing intensity. The two photographs Kate had given him rested on his nightstand, illuminated by the soft glow of his bedside lamp, powered by the still humming generator. Each time he closed his eyes, his mind filled with questions and fragmented thoughts. 50 years of his life had been built on a foundation that had suddenly shifted beneath him. He was not simply Jack Harmon, orphaned grandson of Harold and Margaret. He was Jacob Daniel Rivera, lost nephew of Kate Martinez, grandson of Elena. Rivera. Around 3 in the morning, Jack gave up on sleep altogether. He pulled on his robe and made his way downstairs, careful to avoid the creaky third step that might wake his guests. Max lifted his head from his bed in the corner of the kitchen, thumping his tail in sleepy acknowledgement as Jack entered. Jack put on a pot of coffee, then sat at the kitchen table with the photographs before him. He traced the outline of his biological parents' faces with his fingertip, Daniel and Jessica Rivera, young, smiling, full of promise, lives cut tragically short before he could form lasting memories of them. "Who would I have been," he whispered to the empty kitchen, "if I'd grown up as Jacob Rivera in Cedar Ridge instead of Jack Harmon on this farm?" The question was unanswerable, but it plagued him nonetheless. Would he have gone to college instead of taking over the farm? Would he have met Elena, his wife? Would Lily even exist? The butterfly effect of one moment, a decision by social services, his grandparents' intervention, had altered the entire course of his life. As dawn approached, Jack heard footsteps on the stairs. He looked up to find Kate Martinez entering the kitchen, fully dressed in her now dry uniform. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly, glancing at the coffee pot. Jack stood to pour her a cup. "Too much to process." Kate accepted the mug gratefully, warming her hands around it. "I know. I kept thinking I might wake up and discover this was all some strange dream." I've spent my whole life wondering about my parents, Jack admitted, returning to his seat. But I never imagined... He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the photographs. A whole other family, Kate finished for him. I understand. It must feel like the world's turned upside down. Jack nodded, grateful for her perception. The strangest part is that I'm angry and grateful at the same time. The Harmons gave me a good life, a home, this farm. But they also took something from me, the choice to know where I came from. Kate was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Family is complicated, she said finally, even without extraordinary circumstances like these. Did you know them? My parents? Jack asked, his voice hesitant. In all the shock of the revelation, he hadn't thought to ask this fundamental question. Kate's expression softened. Jessica was my big sister. She was 8 years older than me. I was just a teenager when they died, but yes, I knew them well. She smiled at a distant memory. Jessica was an elementary school teacher. Daniel worked construction but dreamed of starting his own business someday. They were good people, Jack, happy, so in love with each other and with you. Jack absorbed this information like parched earth takes in rain, eagerly, desperately. What did they call me? Was it Jacob or... Jake, Kate replied immediately. Always Jake. Jessica insisted it was more playful than Jacob, better suited to a little boy who never stopped moving. She laughed softly. You were a handful from what I remember, always climbing, exploring. My sister used to say you were born without fear. The nickname resonated somewhere deep within Jack. Jake, had he once answered to that name? Were there echo memories somewhere in his consciousness of his mother calling him to dinner, his father tossing him in the air? The house in this photo, Jack said, pointing to the image of his parents. Where was it? Cedar Valley Road, on the east side of Cedar Ridge. It's still there, though it's been renovated. Different family lives there now. Kate took a sip of her coffee. Our family home, where my parents raised us, where Elena still lives with me, is about 2 miles from there. So close. All this time, so incredibly close. Jack could have driven past these houses hundreds of times in his life, never knowing their significance. I have a million questions, Jack admitted, running a hand through his hair, but I don't even know where to start. That's natural, Kate assured him, and you don't have to figure it all out at once. This is just the beginning. The beginning. The phrase held both promise and uncertainty. At 53, Jack had never expected to embark on a journey of self-discovery quite like this. Does your mother, my grandmother, know you found me? Jack asked. Kate shook her head. I've been on duty since the storm hit. No opportunity to call home. She glanced at her watch. She's probably worried about me staying out all night in this weather. What will you tell her? Jack asked, suddenly nervous at the prospect of meeting the elderly woman who had spent decades wondering about his fate. The truth, Kate said simply, that a storm brought us together after all these years. She might see some poetry in that, considering how a storm took her daughter and son-in-law. Jack nodded slowly. I'd like to meet her, but I'm not sure who. She'll be meeting Jack Harmon or Jacob Rivera. I don't know if I can be the grandson she's been waiting for. You don't have to be anyone but yourself, Kate said firmly. Elena has no expectations beyond knowing you're alive and well. The rest, whatever relationship develops, will happen naturally, or it won't. There's no script for this, Jack. The kitchen was gradually brightening as dawn broke outside. The Nihu storm had finally passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world. Jack stood and moved to the window. Branches and debris littered the yard, but the sky was clearing, streaks of pink and gold spreading across the horizon. I should check on the animals, assess any damage, Jack said, the practical farmer in him asserting itself despite the emotional. Turbulence. Of course, I need to report in, let the department know we're all safe. Kate stood as well. My radio should work now that the storm's passed. They moved with purpose, finding comfort in returning to familiar responsibilities. As Jack filled Max's water bowl, another set of footsteps announced the arrival of Diana Collins, already dressed and tidy, despite the unusual circumstances. "Good morning," she greeted them, glancing between Jack and Kate with subtle curiosity. "Everyone sleep well as can be expected," Jack replied diplomatically. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." As the house gradually awoke, Jack found himself watching the interactions with new awareness. Richard and Tyler Collins, Abby Martinez, strangers brought together by chance and weather, moved through his kitchen with the easy camaraderie of shared experience. They talked of the storm, of roads likely to be passable, of plans now that the weather had cleared. Jack participated in the conversation, offering insights about local conditions, but part of him remained detached, observing from a distance. These people knew nothing of the seismic shift that had occurred in his life overnight. To them, he was simply Jack Harmon, the helpful farmer who had offered shelter from the storm. Kate caught his eye across the room, offering a small, understanding smile. In that moment, Jack realized she was the only person in the world who fully comprehended what he was experiencing. His newfound aunt, a stranger just hours ago, now held this profound connection to him. After breakfast, the Collins family prepared to depart, expressing heartfelt gratitude for Jack's hospitality. We can't thank you enough," Diana said, clasping his hand warmly. "Not everyone would open their home to strangers these days." "It was no trouble," Jack replied automatically, the phrase feeling inadequate for the life-changing encounter the storm had precipitated. As the Collins SUV disappeared down his gravel driveway, Jack turned to find Kate and Abby standing on the porch, the sergeant now speaking into her radio, confirming their status and location. "Roads are clearing," Kate informed him, clipping the radio back to her belt. "Emergency services are still dealing with some flooding on the east side of the county, but most main routes are passable." Jack nodded, trying to ignore the sudden anxiety that gripped him. With the storm's passing came decision time. What happened next would set the course for whatever this new reality would become. "I need to call my daughter," Jack said suddenly. "Lily should know about this before I meet anyone else." "Of course," Kate agreed. "Family first, always. Family." The word had expanded overnight, encompassing people Jack had never met, connections he had never known existed. He glanced at his watch. 6:30 a.m. here meant 4:30 a.m. in California. Too early to call Lily now. A reprieve, however brief. "I should check the property, make sure there's no serious damage," Jack said, needing physical activity to process his thoughts. "Mind if we join you?" Kate asked. "Abby and I could use the fresh air before heading back." Jack hesitated only briefly, before nodding. "I'd appreciate the company." They set out across the muddy farmyard, Max trailing behind them despite his arthritic joints. The storm had left its mark. Scattered branches, a section of fence down near the cattle pasture. The apple orchard partially flooded, but nothing catastrophic. As they walked, Abby gradually overcame her initial shyness and began asking questions about the farm. Jack explained the seasonal rhythms of rural life, the challenges and rewards of working the land. The teenager listened with genuine interest, occasionally glancing between her mother and Jack as if searching for family resemblances. "Mom says your daughter lives in California," Abby ventured at one point. "What does she do there?" "Lily works for a tech company in San Francisco. Graphic design," Jack replied, realizing as he spoke that his daughter might now have cousins she'd never met. Would she welcome this expanded family or see it as an unwelcome complication? "That's cool," Abby said appreciatively. "I'm thinking about studying design too, but more like architectural design." Jack smiled at the coincidence. "Your uncle, my father, was in construction, according to your mother. Abby's eyes widened slightly, this connection to her unknown relatives clearly striking her. Really, that's... wow. Genes are strange things, Kate commented softly, watching their interaction with a complex expression. They completed their circuit of the property, ending back at the farmhouse, just as the sun fully emerged from behind the dissipating clouds. The day promised to be beautiful, the storm's violence giving way to serene clarity, nature's own metaphor for Jack's unfolding situation. "We should head back," Kate said reluctantly, checking her watch. "I need to file a report, and Elena will be worried." The moment of decision had arrived. Jack took a deep breath, steadying himself against the porch railing. "If you don't mind waiting a bit longer, I'd like to come with you, to meet Elena, after I call Lily." Kate's expression brightened. "We'd be happy to wait. Take whatever time you need." Inside, Jack retreated to his study to make the call in private. Lily answered on the fourth ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Dad, is everything okay? It's like super early here." "I'm sorry to wake you, sweetheart," Jack said, suddenly unsure how to explain the situation. "There was a big storm here, but everything's fine. The farm's okay. But something important has happened." "What is it?" Lily asked, sounding more alert now, concern evident in her voice. Jack closed his eyes, gathering his thoughts. "I found out some information about my parents, my biological parents. It turns out they weren't Thomas and Catherine Harmon, and they didn't die in a car accident." "Wait, what?" Lily's confusion was palpable even across the miles. "Dad, you're not making sense." "I know, I'm sorry," Jack sighed. "It's complicated, and I'm still processing it myself. But the short version is that my biological parents were Daniel and Jessica Rivera. They died in a flash flood when I was 2, and it seems I was adopted by Harold and Margaret afterward, without my biological family's knowledge or consent." Silence stretched across the line as Lily absorbed this information. "How did you find this out?" she finally asked. "A police sergeant got stranded here during the storm. Kate Martinez. She's my aunt, my biological mother's sister. She recognized me." Wow, that's incredible." Lily sounded stunned. "Are you okay?" The simple question nearly undid Jack's composure. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "It's a lot to take in. Apparently, I have a whole extended family in Cedar Ridge, including a grandmother who's still alive." "You have a grandmother?" Lily repeated, the implications clearly dawning on her. "Which means I have a great-grandmother I never knew existed." "Yes," Jack confirmed. "Her name is Elena Rivera. She's 88. I'm going to meet her today." "Do you want me to come home?" Lily asked immediately. "I can try to get a flight today or tomorrow." Jack felt a rush of gratitude for his daughter's offer. Despite the distance that had grown between them, she was still ready to drop everything in a crisis. "No, honey, you don't need to do that. Not yet, anyway. Let me meet these people first. Figure out what this means. Then maybe you could come visit soon. Meet them too, if you want." "Of course I want to," Lily said emphatically. "Dad, this is huge. This is your family, our family, family." There was that word again, expanding, reshaping itself to include new branches on a tree Jack had always believed was stunted and sparse. "I'll call you tonight," Jack promised. "After I've met Elena, tell you how it went." "Please do," Lily urged. "And Dad, try to be open to this. It sounds like an amazing opportunity." After ending the call, Jack sat motionless in his study chair for several minutes. Lily's reaction, immediate acceptance, even excitement, had surprised him. Somehow he had expected reluctance or skepticism. Perhaps the younger generation was more adaptable to sudden change, more open to expanding their concept of family. Jack rose and moved to the small closet in the corner of the study. Inside hung his seldom-used dress clothes, a sport coat, a few button-down shirts not stained with farm work. He selected a clean blue shirt and khaki pants, changed quickly, and even ran a comb through his hair, small preparations for what might be the most significant meeting of his life. When he emerged, Kate and Abby were waiting in the kitchen, the sergeant having used the time to file her report via radio. Jack had fed and secured Max with extra water, unsure how long he would be away from the farm. "Ready?" Kate asked gently, recognizing the significance of his changed clothes and freshly combed hair. Jack nodded, not trusting his voice entirely. As they stepped outside, he paused to look back at the farmhouse, the only home he could remember, the center of Jack Harmon's identity. Would it feel different when he returned? Would he see it through changed eyes? "We can take my cruiser," Kate offered, "unless you'd prefer to drive separately." "Together is fine," Jack replied, making a conscious choice to move forward. "Lead the way." The drive to Cedar Ridge took just under 40 minutes. Jack sat in the passenger seat of Kate's cruiser, watching familiar countryside roll past with new eyes. He had traveled this road countless times over the decades, to sell produce at the farmer's market, to purchase equipment, to attend the occasional community event. Never had he imagined that each journey had brought him within miles of his biological family. "That's the turn to Elmwood Creek," Jack noted as they passed a side road. "Where my parents, where Daniel and Jessica were caught in the flood." Kate nodded, her hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "The same creek that flooded last night. History has a strange way of echoing sometimes." In the back seat, Abby remained respectfully quiet, sensing the weight of the moment. The teenager occasionally caught Jack's eye in the rearview mirror, offering small, encouraging smiles. As they entered Cedar Ridge, Jack found himself studying the town more intently than he ever had before. The central square with its gazebo and century-old oak trees, the red brick courthouse, the collection of small businesses lining Main Street. Had his parents walked these sidewalks? Had they picnicked in this park? Was there an alternate universe, where he had grown up here, playing Little League on the diamond visible in the distance? "My mother lives with me on Maple Avenue," Kate explained, as they turned onto a tree-lined street of modest but well-maintained homes. "After my father passed, it made more sense for her to move in with us than to stay in the old family home." Jack nodded, his throat suddenly dry, as Kate pulled into the driveway of a 2-story white house with green shutters and a wraparound porch. Flower boxes overflowed with late summer blooms, and a porch swing moved gently in the breeze. "Pretty place," Jack managed, delaying the inevitable by focusing on details. "Elena's quite the gardener, even at her age," Kate replied with a smile. "Says it keeps her young." She cut the engine but made no immediate move to exit the vehicle. "Jack, before we go in, are you sure you're ready for this? There's no rush. We could take more time if you need it." Jack appreciated the consideration, but shook his head firmly. "I've lost 50 years already. I don't want to lose another day." Kate's eyes shone with understanding as she nodded. "All right then. Let's go meet your grandmother." They climbed the porch steps together, Jack painfully aware of his hammering heart. Before Kate could reach for her keys, the front door opened to reveal a slender Hispanic woman in her early 60s. "About time you got home," she admonished Kate. "Mama's been worried sick with you out in that storm all night." "Sorry, Maria," Kate replied. "It was a complicated situation. This is my sister-in-law," she explained to Jack. "Maria helps care for Elena when I'm working." Maria's curious gaze shifted to Jack, then back to Kate, clearly wondering about this stranger accompanying her so early in the morning. "Maria," Kate said, her voice taking on a formal quality, "this is Jack Harmon. He's—" She paused, searching for the right words. "He's Jacob, Jessica and Daniel's son." Maria's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock. "Dios mío," she whispered, staring at Jack as if he were an apparition. "Little Jake?" Jack nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond to this recognition from a woman who knew a version of him that he himself had no memory of. "Hello?" Maria crossed herself quickly, then stepped back from the doorway. Come in, come in. Elena is in the sunroom. She's having her morning tea." Jack followed Kate into a warm, inviting home filled with family photographs and comfortable furniture. The scent of coffee and cinnamon rolls wafted from the kitchen, triggering something in his memory, a fragment so distant he couldn't quite grasp it. "Should I tell her first?" Maria whispered urgently to Kate. "Prepare her." Kate considered this, then shook her head. "I think just seeing him will be—" She glanced at Jack. "Some things don't need explanation." They moved through the house to a bright sunroom at the rear, where an elderly woman sat in a cushioned wicker chair, a book open on her lap, and a teacup on the table beside her. Despite her advanced age, Elena Rivera sat straight-backed and dignified, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her dark eyes clear and alert as she looked up at their entrance. Katerina," she greeted her daughter with obvious relief. "You're safe. The storm was terrible." "I'm fine, Mama," Kate assured her, moving to kiss her mother's cheek. "The department had us checking on remote properties. I ended up staying at a farm overnight when the bridges flooded." Elena nodded, her gaze shifting to Jack, who stood frozen in the doorway. Something flickered in the elderly woman's eyes, confusion, then intense focus, then dawning recognition that seemed to transform her entire being. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though she seemed to already know the answer. Kate took a deep breath. "Mama, this is Jack Harmon. He owns the farm where I sheltered last night." She paused, then added gently, "He was born Jacob Daniel Rivera, Jessica and Daniel's little boy." For a moment no one moved. Elena stared at Jack, her teacup forgotten, her weathered hands clutching the arms of her chair. Then, with surprising strength for her years, she rose to her feet. "Jake," she said, the single syllable carrying 50 years of hope and heartbreak. Jack stepped forward, drawn by something beyond conscious thought. "Mrs. Rivera," he began formally, but couldn't continue as emotion closed his throat. Elena moved toward him with careful steps, her eyes never leaving his face. When she stood before him, she raised a trembling hand to his cheek, searching his features with an intensity that seemed to penetrate to his very soul. "Jessica's eyes," she whispered. "You have my daughter's eyes." Jack stood perfectly still, allowing this intimate inspection by a woman who was both a stranger and his closest living blood relative. Elena's hand was cool against his skin, her touch gentle as she traced the line of his jaw, the curve of his eyebrow, as if committing every detail to memory. "I never stopped looking for you," she said, her voice stronger now. "Never stopped, believing I would see you again." In her face, Jack could see echoes of the woman in the photograph Kate had shown him, his mother. The same high cheekbones, the same determined set of the jaw. Genes that had passed from grandmother to mother. To him, connections that transcended time and separation. "I didn't know," Jack said simply. "All this time, I didn't know." Elena nodded, understanding the volumes contained in those few words. "But now you do, and you came to find me. The storm brought us together," Kate explained softly from behind them. "I recognized him immediately." A smile transformed Elena's face, erasing years of worry. "The storm," she repeated, finding meaning in the coincidence. "Water took my Jessica and Daniel, and now water brings their son back to me. God works in mysterious ways." Jack wasn't sure about divine intervention, but he couldn't deny the extraordinary sequence of events that had led to this moment. What were the odds that Kate Martinez would seek shelter at his specific farm during last night's storm? That she would recognize him after 50 years of separation? The statistical improbability was staggering. "Please sit," Elena said, gesturing to the chairs around a small table in the sunroom. "Maria, bring coffee and pastries. My grandson is home." The simple declaration, "my grandson," hit Jack with unexpected force. He sank into one of the offered chairs, suddenly grateful for its support, as his legs felt unsteady beneath him. Abby, who had been hanging back respectfully, now stepped forward to give her great-grandmother a gentle hug. "Isn't it amazing, Abuela?" she said, her excitement finally breaking through her earlier restraint. "A miracle," Elena agreed, reaching for Jack's hand across the table. Her fingers were knobbly with arthritis, but surprisingly strong as they clasped his. "Tell me about your life, Jacob, everything." "It's Jack, actually," he corrected gently. "Jack Harmon is the only name I've ever known." Something like sadness flickered across Elena's face, but she nodded in acceptance. "Jack, then. Tell me about Jack." Where to begin? How to compress 50 years into a morning conversation? Jack started hesitantly, explaining about his grandparents, the Harmons, and the farm, his education at the local school, meeting his wife Elena, a coincidence of names that made the elderly woman smile, the birth of Lily, his life as a farmer. He spoke. Maria brought coffee and freshly baked cinnamon rolls that triggered another flash of distant memory. The scent was deeply familiar, comforting in a way Jack couldn't quite articulate. "Jessica made these every Sunday," Elena explained, noticing his reaction to the pastries. "Her special recipe. You loved them as a little boy." This tangible connection. To his mother. Her recipe, a flavor he had experienced with her, affected Jack profoundly. He took a bite and something resonated in his mind, a sense of déjà vu so powerful it momentarily silenced him. "I remember," he said softly, surprising himself. Not clearly, but something about sitting in a high chair, the smell of these rolls, someone singing. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Jessica always sang when she baked, old Spanish lullabies her grandmother taught her. The morning passed in a blur of stories and photographs. Elena had preserved everything related to her lost grandson. Baby clothes, toys, countless photographs documenting his first 2 years of life. She brought out albums and keepsakes, narrating each memory with remarkable clarity despite the decades that had passed. For Jack, it was like discovering the first chapters of a book he had started reading in the middle. Here was proof of his existence before the Harmon farm, evidence of a life he had no conscious memory of, but that had undeniably been his. "This was your favorite," Elena said, placing a well-worn stuffed dog in his hands. "You called him Pup. Wouldn't sleep without him." Jack turned the toy over carefully, marveling at this artifact from his earliest years. Had the Harmons kept similar mementos? If so, they had never shared them with him. "And here," Elena continued, showing him a photograph of a grinning toddler on a tricycle, "this was your 2nd birthday, the last one we celebrated together." Jack studied the image, himself at 2 years old, blissfully unaware that within months his entire world would change dramatically. The child in the photo bore little resemblance to the weathered farmer he had become, yet the connection was undeniable. As morning stretched into afternoon, other family members began to arrive, alerted by Kate's phone calls. Jack's uncle Roberto, his mother's brother, arrived first, a retired postal worker with the same cleft chin that Jack saw in his own mirror. Then came cousins, their spouses, their children, a steady stream of Riveras eager to meet the long-lost member of their family. Each new arrival brought the same sequence of wonder, examination, and acceptance. They studied his features, exclaimed over resemblances, embraced him with an immediacy that was both overwhelming and deeply moving. These people had preserved a place for him in their hearts despite his absence, maintaining the connection of blood and shared history across the decades. "You look just like Uncle Daniel," said one of Roberto's daughters, a woman in her 40s named Sophia. "It's uncanny," He has Grandma's smile, another cousin observed. Pure Rivera. Jack felt simultaneously exposed and embraced, scrutinized and accepted. These people were strangers, yet undeniably family. They shared his DNA, his history, his roots in ways the Harmons, for all their loving care, never could. Around 2 o'clock, sensing Jack's growing overwhelm, Kate suggested a break. Maybe we could show Jack around town, she proposed. Some of the places that were important to Jessica and Daniel. An excellent idea, Elena agreed, patting Jack's hand. You must be. Spinning with all this attention, some fresh air would do you good. Grateful for the respite, Jack followed Kate to her cruiser, Roberto joining them to provide additional context and memories. As they drove through Cedar Ridge, the men pointed out significant landmarks: the elementary school where Jessica had taught, the construction company where Daniel had worked, the church where they had been married. And this, Roberto said, as they pulled up to a modest ranch house with blue siding, was their home, where you lived for the first 2 years of your life. Jack stared at the house, trying to reconcile it with the faded photograph Kate had shown him. The exterior had been updated, the yard landscaped differently, but the basic structure remained the same. Would you like to get out? Take a closer look? Kate asked gently. Jack shook his head. This felt like a step too far for today, an invasion of another family's space. No, just seeing it is enough for now. They continued their tour, ending at the Cedar Ridge Cemetery, where simple matching headstones marked the graves of Jessica and Daniel Rivera. The dates of their short lives were carved in granite, along with the inscription, "Beloved parents of Jacob, love transcends all boundaries." Jack stood before the graves in silence, overwhelmed by the finality of these markers. Here lay the biological parents he had no memory of, people who had loved him, cared for him, planned a future with him at its center. A future cruelly interrupted by fate and questionable decisions made by others. They would be proud of the man you've become, Roberto said quietly, standing beside him. A good farmer, a father, someone who helps others without hesitation. That's who they were too. Simple words of affirmation from someone who had actually known his parents meant more to Jack than he could express. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. As the afternoon waned, they returned to Kate's house, where the impromptu family reunion continued. Someone had ordered pizza, and children played in the backyard while adults conversed, in clusters throughout the house. Jack found himself at the center of attention, yet occasionally able to step back and observe this newfound family and their natural interactions. They were warm, expressive people, quicker to laugh, to touch, to show emotion than he was accustomed to. Was this cultural, he wondered, or simply the Rivera family's way? Would he have been more demonstrative himself if raised among them? Nature versus nurture, the eternal question now personified in his own existence. "You okay?" Kate asked, finding him alone on the porch as evening approached. "It's a lot to take in." Jack nodded, leaning against the railing. "They're wonderful people. I don't quite know where I fit yet." "You don't have to figure it all out today," Kate reminded him. "This is just the beginning." "I know, and I'm grateful." Jack glanced back toward the house, where the sounds of conversation and laughter spilled out through open windows. "But I should probably head home soon, check on Max, process everything that's happened." Kate nodded, understanding. "Of course. I can drive you, or Roberto offered earlier if you prefer." "I'd appreciate a ride," Jack said, "but I'd like to say goodbye to Elena first, properly." He found his grandmother in the kitchen, supervising the cleanup with the quiet authority of a matriarch. When she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that erased decades of worry from her features. "You're leaving?" she asked, reading his expression. "I need to get back to the farm," Jack explained. My dog, the livestock, responsibilities. Elena nodded, reaching for his hands. You will come back? The question held vulnerability despite her dignified bearing. This woman had lost her grandson. Once, the fear of losing him again was palpable. Yes, Jack promised without hesitation. I'll come back. Soon. Relief washed over Elena's face. Good, because I have 50 years of grandmothering to catch up on. She squeezed his hands. Bring your daughter next time. I want to meet my great-granddaughter. I will, Jack agreed, thinking of Lily's eager response to his phone call. She wants to meet you, too. As goodbyes were said and contact information exchanged with various family members, Jack felt a curious sense of walking between worlds. He was leaving these people who shared his blood and history to return to the familiar solitude of the Harmon farm, a place built on partial truths, but still fundamentally his home. The drive back was quieter than the journey in. Both Jack and Kate lost in their own thoughts. Twilight had settled over the countryside, casting long shadows across fields, freshly washed by the previous night's storm. Thank you, Jack said finally as they turned onto his gravel driveway, for recognizing me, for bringing me to Elena, for everything. Kate smiled, the resemblance to her sister, his mother, suddenly striking in the fading light. Some things are meant to be, I think. That storm brought us together for a reason. As the cruiser pulled up to his farmhouse, Jack saw Max waiting patiently on the porch, the old dog's tail thumping against the wooden boards in greeting. The familiar sight was comforting after a day of new experiences and emotions. Will you be okay? Kate asked as Jack opened the car door. He considered the question seriously. I think so. It's a lot to process, but knowing is better than wondering. It always is, Kate nodded agreement. Call if you need anything, any time. And Sunday dinner at Elena's is a standing invitation. Every week, no exceptions. Jack smiled at the casual inclusion, the immediate acceptance into family routines. I'll remember that. As he watched Kate's cruiser disappear down the driveway, Jack turned to face his farmhouse. The structure looked exactly as it had that morning, yet somehow different, as if his changed perspective had altered the physical reality around him. Max leaned against his leg, offering silent canine support as always. Jack scratched behind the old dog's ears, finding comfort in the familiar gesture. Well, boy, he said softly, it seems like our family just got a whole lot bigger. Inside, Jack moved through his evening routine automatically, feeding Max, checking messages, putting on a pot of coffee. The ordinary actions grounded him after the extraordinary events of the day. Yet as he sat at his kitchen table, where just 24 hours earlier he had been a solitary man with an incomplete past, he felt the beginnings of a profound shift. Within himself, he was still Jack Harmon, farmer, widower, father to Lily, but he was also Jacob Rivera, grandson of Elena, nephew of Kate and Roberto, cousin to a dozen people whose names he was still learning. Both identities were true, both were valid, both were parts of a whole that was still taking shape. On the table before him lay the photographs Kate had given him, his parents, his grandmother surrounded by family. Beside them, he placed a photo of himself with Elena and Roberto from that afternoon, hastily printed from someone's phone before he left. Past and present side by side. Outside his window, the last light of day faded from the sky, the first stars appearing in the east. The storm had passed, leaving clarity in its wake. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new adjustments, new understandings. But for tonight, Jack simply allowed himself to feel the wonder of discovery, the bittersweetness of lost time, and the unexpected gift of being found. 3 months later. The apple orchard glowed golden in the late autumn sunlight. Jack moved between the trees, checking the last of the harvest while Lily followed with a basket, gathering any overlooked fruit. The season had been good, abundant rain through the summer, followed by clear, crisp fall days that brought out the sweetness in the apples. "I think that's the last of them," Jack said, stepping back to survey their work. "Elena will have more than enough for her pies tomorrow." Lily smiled, tucking a stray hair behind her ear. "Abuela's already warned me she's going to teach me the family recipe, whether I want to learn it or not." The casual use of abuela warmed Jack's heart. In the 3 months since the storm that had changed everything, Lily had embraced her newfound family with an enthusiasm that sometimes surprised him. She had flown home from California just days after his discovery, eager to meet Elena and the entire extended Rivera clan. What Jack had worried might be an awkward introduction had instead blossomed into an immediate connection, particularly between Lily and Elena, who had formed a bond that transcended the decades of separation. "She's determined to pass down those recipes to someone," Jack chuckled. "Roberto's kids all claim they're too busy, and Abby says cooking isn't her thing." "Lucky me," Lily replied dryly, though her smile belied any real complaint. "At least I'll head back to San Francisco with some serious culinary skills." Jack's smile faltered slightly at the reminder of her impending departure. Lily had extended her visit to nearly 3 months, working remotely and postponing her return to California repeatedly. Her presence had been a gift during this time of transition, a bridge between his old life and new discoveries. "You've been a huge help," Jack said, hefting the basket of apples, "with the farm and with everything else." Lily reached out to squeeze his arm affectionately. "That's what daughters are for, Dad." They walked together toward the farmhouse, where smoke curled from the chimney against the backdrop of an early sunset. The air held the crispness of approaching winter, promising frost by morning. "So you're really going through with it?" Lily asked, breaking a comfortable silence. "The legal name change." Jack nodded, having made the decision after weeks of consideration. "Just adding to it, not replacing. Jack Jacob Harmon Rivera, honoring both sides of who I am." "I like it," Lily approved. "Has a nice ring to it, and I think Grandma Elena is going to be over the moon." Jack smiled at the thought of Elena's reaction. His biological grandmother had been careful not to pressure him, respecting the complex emotions involved in reconciling his dual identity. But he knew the official acknowledgement of his Rivera heritage would mean the world to her. As they approached the house, the sound of laughter drifted from the porch, where Kate sat with her daughter Abby and Roberto's son Miguel, all three huddled over mugs of cider. Sunday gatherings had expanded beyond Elena's house to include regular visits to the farm, family members flowing between the two locations as if making up for lost decades. "Successful harvest?" Kate called out as they climbed the porch steps. "More than enough for Elena's pies," Jack confirmed, setting down the basket. "Where's Max?" "Inside by the fire with Tia Maria," Abby answered. "She's spoiling him rotten with treats again." Jack shook his head in mock disapproval. "That dog's getting more pampered in his old age than I ever imagined possible." The changes extended beyond family connections. Jack had begun the process of reorganizing the farm operations, scaling back certain aspects to make room for new priorities. The cattle had been sold, the wheat acreage reduced. The apple orchard, however, had received renewed attention, with Elena suggesting heirloom varieties that might thrive in the local climate. Inside, the farmhouse itself reflected the merging of Jack's two worlds. Photos of the Riveras now shared wall space with images of the Harmons and Elena, his late wife. Objects from his biological family's history, his mother's recipe book, his father's carpenter's level, a quilt Elena had made for him as a baby. Now occupied places of honor alongside the familiar furnishings of his life as Jack Harmon. Maria looked up from where she sat by the fire, Max's head resting contentedly on her lap. "Perfect timing," she announced. "The stew is almost ready and Roberto just called. He and Carmen are on their way with the bread." Sunday dinners had become a new tradition, alternating between Elena's house in Cedar Ridge and the farm. Tonight would be special, Jack's birthday, the first celebrated with his biological family since he was 2 years old. Elena had insisted on cooking despite her arthritis, creating traditional dishes from recipes handed down through generations. "Of Rivera's. Need any help in the kitchen?" Lily offered, washing her hands at the sink. "You can check on the rice," Maria suggested. "Elena will be back in a minute. She's just resting upstairs." At 73, Maria had become an unexpected regular at the farm, initially accompanying Elena on visits, but gradually establishing her own connection with Jack. As his mother's closest childhood friend, she provided another link to the past Jack had lost, filling in details and stories that even Elena sometimes forgot. "I found this while going through some old boxes," Maria said, handing Jack a worn envelope as he settled into his chair by the fire. "Thought you might want to see." Inside was a child's drawing, crude stick figures labeled in an adult's handwriting. "Jake, Mommy, Daddy, Pup." The paper had yellowed with age. The crayon marks faded, but still vibrant enough to make out a blue house, green grass, a yellow sun. "You made this about a month before they died," Maria explained softly. "Jessica kept everything you created. Said you were going to be an artist someday." Jack traced the childish scrawls with his fingertip, a powerful wave of emotion washing over him. This tangible connection to his earliest years, proof of his existence as Jacob Rivera, still had the power to move him deeply, even after months of similar discoveries. "Thank you," he said simply, carefully returning the drawing to its envelope. These fragments of his first life had become precious to him, each one helping to complete a picture that had been incomplete for so long. The sound of vehicles on the gravel driveway announced more arrivals. Soon, the house was filled with Rivera. Relatives, Roberto and his wife Carmen, their adult children with spouses and offspring, Kate's husband returning from a business trip. Last to arrive was Elena herself, having rested upstairs before making a grand entrance for her grandson's birthday celebration. "There he is," Elena announced, her face lighting up as she entered the living room. Despite her 88 years, she moved with purpose toward Jack, arms outstretched for an embrace. "El cumpleañero." Jack rose to meet her, enfolding his grandmother in a gentle hug. "Careful now, I hear you've been cooking all day against doctor's orders." Elena waved away his concern. "Doctors know nothing about the healing power of making food for family. It's good for the soul." Dinner was served family style at the long table in the dining room, a space that had rarely been used during Jack's solitary years. Now it overflowed with dishes, laughter and conversations in a mixture of English and Spanish. Jack sat at the head of the table with Elena to his right, and Lily to his left, the positioning a subtle acknowledgement of the bridge they created between his past and present. "Before we eat," Roberto said, rising to his feet and lifting his glass, "a toast to the birthday boy, though boy seems a stretch for a man of 53. Good-natured laughter rippled around the table as glasses were raised. "To Jack," Roberto continued, his expression growing more serious, "who returned to us through a miracle of timing and recognition, who has opened his home and heart to family he never knew existed, who has shown us that it's never too late for new beginnings." "To Jack," the group echoed, glasses clinking. Jack nodded acknowledgement, momentarily too moved for speech. These people, strangers just months ago, had become an integral part of his life with a speed and ease that still sometimes astonished him. As the meal progressed, Jack found himself watching the interactions around his table. Lily deep in conversation with her newfound cousins, Kate and Maria reminiscing about childhood adventures with Jessica, Elena presiding over it all with the satisfied air of a matriarch who had finally gathered all her chicks under one roof. "You're quiet," Elena observed during a lull in the general conversation. "Everything okay?" Jack smiled reassuringly, just taking it all in. It's still surprising sometimes how quickly this has become normal. Elena patted his hand, understanding in her eyes. Family has a way of doing that. The connections were always there, just waiting to be discovered. After dinner, as everyone moved back to the living room for dessert, Jack slipped away to his study for a moment of reflection. The small room had been his sanctuary during the years of solitude following Elena's death, a place where he could retreat with his thoughts and memories. On the desk lay a leather-bound journal Kate had given him shortly after their reconnection. "For processing," she had said simply. Jack had initially been skeptical. He'd never been one for writing down his feelings, but over the weeks he had found unexpected solace in recording his journey of discovery. He opened the journal now, turning to a blank page, and began to write. Birthday reflections, 53 years old today. First celebrated as Jacob Rivera in 51 years. The house is full of family, my family, in a way I never imagined possible. Lily is thriving among her cousins. Elena is in her element as the family matriarch, and I'm somewhere in between the person I was and the person I might have been, creating something new from both. Still think about the Harmons sometimes, wondering if they truly believed they were doing what was best. Their deception shaped my entire life, yet gave me this farm, my education, my marriage to Elena, our daughter Lily. How can I reconcile gratitude and betrayal? Perhaps I don't need to. Perhaps it's enough to acknowledge both, carrying them together as parts of a whole. The storm that brought Kate to my door that night wasn't just coincidence. Call it fate, or divine intervention, or statistical improbability. Whatever it was, it changed everything. A flash flood took my parents 51 years ago. Another flood brought their family back to me. Water destroys, water cleanses. Water reveals what was hidden. A soft knock interrupted his writing. Jack looked up to find Lily in the doorway, a small wrapped package in her hands. "They're about to bring out the cake," she said. "But I wanted to give you this privately first." Jack accepted the package, carefully removing the wrapping paper to reveal a wooden picture frame. Inside was a photograph he had never seen before, himself at perhaps 18 months old, sitting on his father's shoulders at what appeared to be a county fair. Both were laughing, caught in a moment of pure joy. "Where did you find this?" Jack asked, stunned. "Elena found it in an old album. I had it restored and enhanced." Lily sat on the edge of the desk, watching his reaction. "I thought you might want it for in here. A reminder." Jack studied the image of the father he had no conscious memory of, a young man who would never see his 30s, never know his son had grown into a farmer like his own father, never meet his granddaughter. The sense of loss was profound, yet alongside it ran a current of gratitude for this visual evidence of having been loved. "It's perfect," Jack said simply. "Thank you." Lily hesitated, then asked the question she had been circling for weeks. "Do you ever wish you'd known sooner, about the Riveras, I mean?" Jack considered this carefully. "Sometimes. I think about all the years Elena waited, hoping. All the family gatherings I missed. All the questions I could have asked people who are gone now." He paused. "But then I might not have become the person I am, might not have met your mother, might not have had you." Lily nodded understanding. "Butterfly effect." "Exactly. Change one thing, you change everything." Jack placed the framed photo on his desk, positioning it beside a picture of himself with the Harmons and another of his wedding day. "All we can do is move forward with what we know now." A chorus of voices called from the living room, summoning them for cake and the official birthday celebration. Lily stood, offering her hand to her father. Ready to rejoin the chaos? She asked with a smile. Jack took her hand, rising from his desk. Chair. Lead the way. They returned to find the living room transformed. Someone had strung up colorful paper decorations, and a large cake blazed with candles in the center of the coffee table. Elena presided over the scene, directing the placement of plates and forks with the authority of a general. "There you are," she exclaimed when she spotted Jack. "We were about to send a search party." "Just having a moment with my very thoughtful daughter," Jack explained, squeezing Lily's shoulder affectionately. Elena beamed at them both, clearly approving of their bond. "Well, come make a wish before the candles melt all over my perfectly good cake." Jack approached the cake amid a chorus of the birthday song in both English and Spanish, the voices of his newfound family blending harmoniously in the warm living room of the farmhouse that had seen so much solitude. 53 candles flickered before him, representing a life lived in 2 distinct chapters, before and after the storm that had brought Kate Martinez to his door. As Jack looked around at the faces surrounding him, Kate and Abby, Roberto and his family, Maria, Elena watching with tears of joy in her eyes, and Lily beside him, he felt a sense of completion that had eluded him for as long as he could remember. "Make a wish, Dad," Lily urged. Jack smiled, knowing with sudden clarity that he had no need for wishes anymore. The emptiness that had followed him throughout his life, the questions about his origins, the sense of disconnection, had been filled with answers, with relationships, with a family history that stretched back generations and forward into a future he was only beginning to imagine. "I already have everything I could wish for," he said simply, and blew out the candles in a single breath. Later, as the party wound down and family members began to depart with hugs and promises to gather again soon, Jack stood on the porch with Elena watching the first stars appear in the clear night sky. "Happy?" she asked, her shoulder leaning slightly against his arm. "Yes," Jack answered without hesitation. "Different than I expected at this point in my life, but yes, very happy." Elena nodded, satisfied. "Your mother would be pleased. Jessica always said happiness was the most important thing she wanted for you." "Tell me again what she was like," Jack requested, never tiring of these stories that helped him know the woman who had given him life. As Elena began to speak, painting verbal portraits of a daughter 50 years gone, Jack felt the familiar duel, awareness that had become his new normal, gratitude for the life he had lived as Jack Harmon, and wonder at the connections he was discovering as Jacob Rivera. He was both of these people now, the sum of all his experiences, known and unknown. The storm that had brought revelation had cleared to reveal not just a new landscape, but a more complete understanding of the terrain he had been traveling all along. The old farmhouse had weathered countless storms over the decades, but none had transformed its occupant quite like the downpour 3 months ago. Jack Harmon, soon to be legally Jack Jacob Harmon Rivera, stood under the stars with his grandmother, surrounded by the echoes of family voices, finally home in the fullest sense of the word. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.